question.
Thank you. Tony Curzon-Price from Open Democracy. I have a question for Rory Stewart about what it is exactly you think we can do. So at one point, I think in your opening speech, you said what we can do is learn foreign languages better, engage with local populations, sort of have better chaps in the Foreign Office, as it were. I would suggest, and I wonder whether you agree, that one thing we can do is actually live up to the ideals that we profess to live by and that we profess that these countries also should live by. And just to take an example, the history of our engagement in the Arabian Peninsula over the last 100 years is a history of promising freedom and democracy, but in fact doing everything to make sure that they could never possibly work, because we have always put the interests of commercial convenience above the interests of those ideals. And we continue, I pledge, to do so, in that we allow BAE Systems or BP or our dependence on oil to come before actually supporting Republican, nationalist, secular governments in the Middle East. And we've always been terrified of them. So isn't there much more we can do than just have better chaps on the ground? Can't we actually be true to our ideals?
Yes, we can do much better to be true to our ideals. I mean, the history of Britain's involvement in the Middle East since the First World War is shameful. What we did after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the way we connived with the Syrian French colony, the way we created a colony in Iraq was shameful. So yes, we can. But, and this is another thing, let's not be so carried away with an illusory nature of what we or our allies are or can be into the bigger danger, which is that we talk so much about our ideals, we live the dream of our principles so much that we raise the expectation of people in other countries in ways that we're unable to fulfill. Probably the thing that actually hits me hardest about Iraq was that our presence there on the ground, and my experience in Misan, is that the more I talked about human rights, the more I talked about our principles, the more I encouraged people to come forward, Haida, who worked with me as my translator, or women who joined our provincial council, who were subsequently killed by the Saddamist militia, and who we've done absolutely nothing to protect or to get out of the country, because we did what we couldn't do. We exceeded our resources. We made promises we couldn't fulfill, and we raised expectations which we were unable to do anything about. So I think that's almost the crueler betrayal.
But the other side of that question, which you might also address, Rory, is should we actually be having in our mind the idea of promoting democracy, not necessarily by offering false promises to the people, but by taking on those who are thwarting it, or is it appropriate for us instead to concentrate on the very important point of securing oil, keeping friendly with those who can give the oil on which our economy depends? In other words, have we got our ideals in the wrong order? Do you have a position on whether or not we should actually possibly jeopardize our economic health in favor of the idea of pushing the democracy notion?
Okay, this is a really good question because it shows what the whole problem is. The whole problem is that we have created a black and white world in which we imagine that we have to choose all the time, either by being Dick Cheney and focused on oil and oppression and plotting up despots, or on the other hand, Amnesty International with absolutely no contact with the world at all. This is not the choice that we face. This is not what our diplomats are there to do. That's not what our international policy is about. We need to discover how to be pragmatically moral, how to be passionately moderate, how to combine our moral instincts with our interests, and be realistic about what we can and can't do. The reason we let people down all the time, The reason we invade these countries and create a mess, the reason we're probably going to do it again for the next 15 years, is we have never managed to get a mature conversation going about what we're actually doing and what we can do in these countries. We're not able to understand, firstly, that these countries are not our countries, that these countries do have a claim of sovereignty, that they have their own cultures, their own languages, and they don't really like foreigners being in them. And that therefore what we do with other people's countries, a bit like what I would do with you if you were my friend, has to be limited by a respect for other people's autonomy and other people's choice, and cannot involve an endless oscillation between black and white, assuming that the only choices we face are either oil or the most pure conception of our own moral duty.
Doesn't that rather ally the preferences of the people and the regime? What do you think?
Well, I was going to say much the same thing. I mean, if we're not very careful, what this conversation becomes is a conversation in which I characterise what Rory says as being effectively amoral and abstentionist, and he characterises what I'm saying as whatever we do, let's get troops in there, even if we don't have them, at the first available opportunity, and tell everybody in those countries exactly what they should be doing. And of course, bits of both those things have happened under various formulations of foreign policy. But I go back to the point that I made right at the beginning about what I thought it was in our long-term interest to have happen and to have encourage as items of foreign policy. And I also go back to the question of this, and it's the question you just raised, Jeremy, of sovereign governments. If a sovereign government is behaving in an intolerable way to a large section of its own people, then in that case we must take a view about it. We should take a view about it. Now, I'm not clear from what Rory's saying, even whether, on the basis of what he's arguing, we should take a view. Whether we have a right... Well, it's not clear from that. I mean, a lot of these people would say... and you heard it said at the time of the Balkans. It was said, people put it extremely well, and for a while it was fairly convincing. The Balkans is an incredibly difficult place. It is full of enmities that you don't understand. It is a patchwork quilt of nationalities who have long hated each other. Angels rush in, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Consequently, and this was consequent upon it, the last thing we should do is give an extra push to the fire by, for instance, giving weapons to the Bosnian Muslims or allowing them to have weapons from our sources, consequently meaning that the only people in that civil war who began to have weapons in the first instance were Bosnian Serbs. That was where that particular thing led to. An over-scrupulous notion of what it was that was cultural to the region actually led to the position that there was nothing useful that you could do other than stick a few Dutch troops round a safe haven called Srebrenica and then give up when the Serbs came in to perpetrate the worst massacre in European peacetime history.
I support the Bosnia intervention, so you're not arguing against
it? No, I'm not arguing. You talked about the logic of where Chicago speech goes to. I'm talking about the logic of where where what you outlined could lead a lot of people to go to, and will actually. Rory, it will lead them to... let me just take, for instance, you wrote an absolutely excellent piece for the New York Review of Books at the end of 2009 about Afghanistan. But this is what you said, and it's really interesting. Enlightenment faith that there is nothing intrinsically intractable about Afghan culture and society, and that all men can be perfected to a Western ideal through the application of reason and the laws of social science. Now that, of course, is a caricature. It's a caricature of a position, but it has embedded within it its own position. And its own position, which it doesn't quite state, is Afghan society is intractable to what we would regard as being human rights, social goods, and so on. That's essentially the message that conveys to the reader.
David, I'm going to stop you there because we're running out of time, and I want to just give a profile of the rest of the evening now. I want to take one or two more questions, no more than that. Then, David, you're going to give a quick summing up speech. Then you, Rory. And then we're going to have another vote from all of you. So, questions, please. The gentleman over there.